World War I is over, and so are America's days of legal alcoholic drink. Convinced self-sacrifice and sobriety will bring prosperity and peace as it won victory in war, Americans praise passing of the dry law. And then enforcement begins.
I'm Garth Mullins. This is Crackdown. Episode 34. The Iron Law. On May 31st, 2022, Carolyn Bennett, the Federal Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, held a press conference.
Thank you all for being here. Today, I'm here to announce that I will be granting British Columbia's exemption request. As of January 31st, 2023, adults 18 and over in British Columbia will no longer be subject to criminal charges for the possession of up to 2.5 grams of certain illegal drugs for personal use, and the drugs will not be confiscated.
This was a big moment. It was an important step. Our movement has been fighting for decriminalization for decades. To us, decrim means getting cops, courts, and jails out of our lives. It means that police gotta stop harassing, arresting, and seizing dope off of us. For the past year, VANDU has sent me and a couple of others to sit on a government committee and fight for this vision. Not surprisingly, a lot of our advice was disregarded. Cops fought for low thresholds, and they won. That means that a big proportion of drug users in British Columbia will remain criminalized. Cops and politicians have also been making noise about ramping up enforcement on dealers. On today's show, I talked to Leo Beletsky about why this is a bad idea that could make the overdose crisis even worse. Could you introduce yourself for us?
Sure. My name is Leo Beletsky. I'm a professor of law and health sciences at Northeastern University, which is in Boston, Mass. I'm also on faculty at UC San Diego School of Medicine, and I run the Health and Justice Action Lab at Northeastern. So my research is basically what it sounds like, is at the intersection of law and public health, with focus on overdose, addiction, infectious disease transmission.
Well, thanks. Thanks for coming on the show. We've had some moves in Canada, I guess, over my long life in drugs, which is, people have nicer names for us now. Like back when I was really like late teens, early 20s, there was no word like people who use drugs or something like that, Yep. They just had nasty words, and everybody hated us and thought we were the scourge of the world, and just it was not impolite to just say the worst things, and politicians, everybody said the worst things, but now everyone's kind of more polite. I think they've recognized that this is sort of almost like a more effective form of politics in some ways.
Yeah.
And that includes some police, like some police leaderships, I should say. They've recognized that a kind of a friendly, officer-friendly kind of approach is good for them. And when I've sat on these decriminalization committees with different jurisdictions, I've been on 2 in the last year, spent a lot of hours there now. Mm-hmm. The Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users sent me, and I'll do my job that I'm mandated to do by the board of that organization, because I've been a activist and a member there for a long time. But it means you're sitting on a committee sometimes with cops, and they'll talk nice, like we're trying to save lives here, and they'll tell you, and they told me again and again from different police forces, the RCMP, someone representing the Association of Chiefs of Police, the Vancouver Police Department, that getting drugs off the street is what saves lives.
The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police is calling for simple drug possession to be decriminalized, saying it will keep the country safer and better address addiction issues. For more, let's bring in Chief Constable Adam Palmer.
Addiction is not against the law, and addiction should not be treated as a crime. We still believe that issues like trafficking and production and importation should definitely be dealt with by the police. But simple possession, let's look at another method that will be better for serving all Canadians and getting them on the right path.
Like, we want to save lives, we all want to do this, so that's why we're getting drugs off the street. And that's why we want to focus on the dealers. That's why we really want to go after the dealers. And this go after the dealers is the new kind of consensus. We've been separated off into the poor victim waif drug users and the evil cartel boss drug dealer. That's kind of maybe in the popular and the political imagination in Canada right now.
Merely arresting individuals for simple possession of illicit drugs has proven to be ineffective. Deputy Chief Wilson, in your case, was there a particular experience that changed your mind about the approach to take on this issue?
It was really tragic to see the way that we would have non-addicted traffickers coming into the downtown east side and using addicted members of that community to sell drugs. And that's just one small
And so
example.
there's this emergent consensus. We really got to go after this. Fentanyl is terrible. It's killing everyone. These dealers, they know it. They're setting out to kill people. We're going to go get them. And I just think this is the same logic that's going to make the situation worse.
There are two problems. Well, there are many problems, but there's two major problems with the go after the dealer banner. First, who is defined as a dealer? That definition is very problematic because oftentimes folks who are defined as dealers and get the brunt of punitive approaches are people who engage in survival drug trafficking. Those folks are much more likely to be arrested and prosecuted at the full extent of the law than anyone higher up the chain. Because there are more of these folks, it's easier to make a case. I'll just give an example, if I might. So drug-induced homicide prosecutions take a fatal overdose and reframe it as a murder.
Romello Marshman was 22 when he took what he believed to be cocaine from someone last May. Days later, he was found dead on his couch in Nashville. The medical examiner found high levels of fentanyl in his system.
With it being laced with fentanyl, it's poisoning, it's murder.
Drug dealers, they don't necessarily want the customer dead. They just don't care if that person does die.
Tennessee is one of 20 states prosecuting drug-induced homicide.
So the logic is you share or distribute drugs with someone, you sell those drugs, the person dies, you're now on the hook for their death. So this has been a increasingly favorite tool of drug interdiction. When you
I should just say that this is the same in British Columbia.
Right.
Like in 2017, this is just in the first year after we had this officially declared overdose crisis here. The BC Court of Appeal increased the range of sentencing for trafficking, for fentanyl trafficking, to 18 to 36 months. And that's going up from the sort of standard 6 to 12 months in other parts of Canada. So we got ahead. We said we're going to be harsher.
Yes.
That's currently there's new developments in that, but that was our response. It's just like, oh, we care about you, so we're going to use these harsh measures to fight the overdose crisis.
Right. I think that's an interesting observation too, which is that we now care about drug users, and therefore, under the banner of protecting them, we're going to basically rebrand a lot of users as dealers, and then harshly punish them and say we've done a great job. But
I mean, I went out with this girl for 8 years and I scored for us.
Yeah.
I'd go out and score for us. And so I was carrying two people's supply and giving it to her.
Yes.
You know, so like, what does that make me?
That
Like,
makes you,
it's
under
just
the way that the law is written, I don't know, what the BC criminal code says, but in United States, essentially, the word that's used in these provisions is distribution. I have someone who works with us, Morgan Godwin. I don't know if you've come across her.
Yeah, definitely.
This is her story.
By the age of 21, Morgan Godwin was addicted to heroin. She sold a gram of heroin to one of her best friends, Justin DeLong, who then died of an overdose. She was charged with delivery resulting in death and served 4.5 years in prison.
That was a gift. Federal mandatory minimum for drug delivery resulting in death in the United States is 20 years in federal prison. And so lots of people are now spending lots of time in federal and state custody for essentially sharing or, scoring drugs for their friends or their loved ones. And these are the people that a lot of prosecutors and police are saying, we're putting drug dealers behind bars. We are taking this poison off of our streets.
Morgan caught my eye with this line in a piece that she wrote for the Washington Post: the archetypal predatory drug dealer is a myth. For many, a sale is not about ruthless profit, it's about survival.
Every heroin dealer that I ever met was someone who was addicted to heroin first and foremost. They turned to that out of desperation. Sometimes they were locked out of the legal economy because they'd got felony convictions. And so that if they were able to just buy 3 grams of heroin instead of a half gram and sell it into small little bits to their friends, because we have to develop a social circle. It's not like we can buy heroin from the pharmacy, and it's not profitable at all. Low-level drug dealers make less than minimum wage.
So that's where the rhetoric doesn't meet the reality. And of course what you said also is true, which is even if law enforcement was actually doing what they say that they're doing, which is going after drug trafficking organizations, doing that, taking them at their word, would make matters worse. But they're not even by and large doing that.
Cops in Canada can feel the winds changing, and they're trying to get out ahead. Vancouver Police and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police both officially support the decriminalization of very small amounts of illicit drugs for simple possession. But in the same breath, they want to double down on trafficking, production, and importation. They say this approach will save lives, which of course is bullshit. And people like Leo have studied why. When law enforcement does spectacular busts to get drugs off the street, what happens next? Do we all just go home and kick? No, a vacuum gets created, and it's filled with more and more contaminated drugs. The iron law of prohibition goes some way to explaining this drugs arms race. It's the idea that the more law enforcement there is against a banned substance, the more potent it becomes. More potent means you can more easily smuggle it in a smaller volume. It means more bang for your buck. Leo writes a lot about this, and the classic example is alcohol prohibition.
The entire cocktail culture in the United States, like if you go to a bar in the United States now, a lot of times you'll see people in suspenders and, bow ties and stuff like that. And bartenders don't wear this by accident. It's because this is a legacy of the Prohibition era.
It's against the law to drink, so drinking is suddenly smart. There's bootleg liquor on every American lip, shiny flask on every hip. By the middle 1920s, nightlife is having its heyday, for America's dry and high.
Americans were, by and large, used to drinking beer and wine. When alcohol became prohibited federally, iron law prohibition explains what occurred, which was that over time, and actually pretty quickly, a lot of the product shifted from being dominated by beer and wine to being dominated by spirits.
Oh, so people weren't drinking screwdrivers and stuff like that before?
Many fewer people were drinking screwdrivers. Consumption preferences really couldn't be expressed because for the folks who were manufacturing and transporting alcohol, there was a clear economic imperative to shift their product towards more potent, more compact supply than beer and wine, which is what a lot of consumers wanted. And so they started to flood the market with spirits.
When the 18th Amendment was passed, I earnestly hoped, with a host of advocates of temperance, that it would be generally supported by public opinion, that this has not been the result, but rather that drinking generally has increased, that the speakeasy has replaced the saloon, not only unit for unit, but probably twofold, if not threefold.
You had lots and lots of situations where the product became adulterated, either through poor manufacturing practices or, in a very sad chapter of American history, the federal government actually deliberately adulterated the supply, the illicit supply, to kind of issue a warning and send a message to the public that this was not safe. And unfortunately, a bunch of people got sick and a bunch of people died. So although right now we don't have evidence that would suggest that the opioid supply is being deliberately adulterated by the government, it does give rise to a lot of the conspiracy theories that you hear about, for example, about the crack cocaine era and the role of the U.S. government in that, as well as the current situation with fentanyl.
So I guess if prohibition ends tomorrow, we're not all gonna go back to smoking opium. That strong injectable opioids are gonna be here to stay for a long time, just like cocktail culture is here to stay.
I think, Garth, that's a very important point, and it's something that I've thought about a lot, because having watched the fentanyl crisis unfold in the United States, originally when we first started looking at it and writing about it, it was, I think, fair to say that the supply was being driven by supplier preferences and not by consumer preferences. In the sense,
absolutely, that's just what was happening here. Is that people wanted heroin, and they were getting fentanyl, and lots of people didn't like it. But then you get habituated, and then you get wired, and then heroin just isn't doing it for you anymore.
Absolutely.
So you gotta get fentanyl.
Yeah, and I think governmental agencies sometimes will sort of point the finger towards consumers, and they'll say, well, look at this. There are people, I hear, law enforcement agents talk about this sometimes. People want this stuff. Like, what do you want us to do? This is what people want.
Sure, I mean, we do now, right? But it's not like we get to walk into like a shop and choose all the different varieties there and say, oh, it's fentanyl for me, right? It's like that desire or that need is conditioned by what's available, which is itself conditioned by the cops who are saying it's all on us.
I think that's a really important point. These consumer preferences, they adjust over time, and they are driven by potency. And so when folks who have been conditioned and habituated towards fentanyl, you give them black tar heroin, it just doesn't have the same pharmacological effects. And so people feel like it's not doing it for them.
Leo has studied the arrival of fentanyl in North America. He's identified a number of causes. Doctors cut thousands of patients off their meds during the big oxymoral panic. Border agents seized more and more heroin along the US-Mexico border, and judges started handing down harsher penalties for dealing and using. All of this brought us fentanyl. And now in BC, we're seeing the next stage, benzodope, a mixture of fentanyl and benzodiazepine-like substances. I was interested to find out that something like this happened in the UK around 2010 or 2011. A fungal poppy disease in Afghanistan led to poor crops. Plus, the US was busy destroying poppy fields, and police in different countries were cracking down on distribution routes. Heroin coming into Britain was getting choked off, so dealers padded it out with benzos like a prazolam. UK drug users started to suffer blackouts, memory loss, and more complicated overdoses. They started getting wired to benzos and becoming polysubstance users, when before they'd only used heroin. We've seen all of that here. I started thinking about the parallels of the move to moonshine during alcohol prohibition and the move to benzodope in the drug war. So let's just leave the speakeasies of the 30s and come to the last couple of years. The first time that benzodope really hit home to me was when we had a partner of someone on our editorial board overdosed just in the next room while we were having a Crackdown listening party, and this was the summer of 2019. Like, we'd all been used to regular opioid overdoses most of our lives, really, but this one was really strange, When did you figure out that it wasn't a regular overdose?
When Laura told me that Narcan didn't work. As much Narcan as they put into me at VANDU. And
that's right, they put shit tons into you. Like, people at VANDU put a bunch, and then the ambulance guys put in a bunch. Do you want me to tell you what I remember from it?
Of course.
Well, he wasn't talking right. He was behaving really weird. He wasn't coming out of it like we would expect. And so we sent him to the hospital, like ambulance to the hospital, right? And, we'd kind of been hearing these anecdotal reports about benzodiazepine-like substances entering the drug stream. So we were seeing fentanyl and these benzo-like substances together. And then when the pandemic hit, it just seemed like this took over. So it was about 6 or 8 months after that that overdose of the editorial board member's partner that it just started happening more and more and more until it just seems like it's overtaken the drug supply around here, and that's all we're seeing now.
Frontline workers on the downtown east side are sounding the alarm after a surge in drug overdoses. They say they've noticed the drug supply lately has been laced with a powerful benzodiazepine along with the opioid fentanyl.
Overdosing on opioids laced with benzos is riskier because naloxone, an immediate reversal drug, does not work on benzos.
They're not really coming back traditionally how they used to. So you're kind of wondering if they're actually coming back.
This is like something that doctors tell me the sedative effects of the combination of benzodiazepines and opioids together is synergistic, that it's really a deeper type of sedative effect.
Right.
Do you think this is iron law, or is this COVID squeezing off the supply chain, or is COVID squeezing the supply chain kind of a type of example of iron law?
Well, this is speculation, and I have to say that the Canadian experience with benzodope has not been reflected in the U.S. yet.
Well, can I tell you something? I'll tell you, the listeners, what happens to us here in Vancouver happens to everyone eventually.
It's true.
We're the fucking bellwether here.
You're right. It's a canary in a coal mine. I think this is really key. Listen, I think that the combination of opioids and benzos is not new. In many ways, calling this overdose crisis, the opioid crisis, obscures and is a smokescreen for the reality that it is a polypharmacy situation. A majority in a lot of jurisdictions of fatal overdoses are polypharmacy overdoses. So opioids with benzos, opioids with alcohol, right? These synergistic effects of depressants happening at the same time.
100%. We see that in the coroner stats here all the time.
So I think that is maybe the precursor to the benzodope situation, and it is my understanding that the benzodope mixing, the cocktail that is circulating, it happens at the cutting level. It is not being brought in as such by the drug trafficking organizations. That's just what I've heard. Maybe what happened is that because of the disruptions of the supply chain, a lot of the sellers may have been kind of strapped for the supply, and they wanted to sell something that was going to pack a punch so that people wouldn't complain that it wouldn't, that wasn't strong enough. And that
Right.
they innovated by making these cocktails and saying, okay, well, this packs a punch. Maybe it's a little bit of a different punch than what you were looking for, but it's still pretty strong.
But is the iron law of prohibition really always so iron? I asked Leo about examples that seem to contradict the law, like weed and rock. So when I first encountered the iron law, I thought, wow, what a great thing, because I was just thinking about the arrival of fentanyl and how it took over from heroin a lot. And I just heard about this in the last few years. But thinking about rock, like crack is not like lower volume than cocaine, and it's not more potent than cocaine, right? Like you're like stepping it down.
I think the thinking is that by applying these enforcement pressures, you create opportunity for innovation, and that innovation oftentimes is trying to kind of squeeze more out of the supply chain, and in so doing, it makes it more dangerous. But the iron law is, I think, packs a broader point, which you rightly note it. And I think, as with all theories, there are sort of inconsistencies, but overall, I think that the rule of thumb holds. And it's a useful frame to apply to.
Rule of thumb sounds so much softer than iron law. I mean, maybe it needs a rebranding, like the copper law of prohibition, or the gold law, or the lead law, like a softer metal that's more malleable.
You're right. It is not a ironclad law. So there are definitely kinks in the system. We could talk about, for example, how that applies to the legal cannabis market, which is sometimes a sort of counterpoint that people pose to the iron law theory.
But the pot's got a lot stronger, though, but that's been in the last decade or two than it was before. It was still illegal in most places.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but the real explosion of innovation in the cannabis field with, the sort of advent of tinctures and edibles and all kinds of other products that really pack a big THC punch. Those were not available through the traditional kind of illicit supply chain. And so I think overall, if you were to map and graph the potency of THC products sold now versus what was sold, 10, 15 years ago, that potency probably is a bunch higher.
Vancouver started from a place where people just smoked opium 113, 114 years ago. And then when that was outlawed, when opium production was outlawed, we started on this escalator of going from stronger and stronger and more potent. And each of those steps has this iron law quality to it. But they also have like these confounding factors that occur, like COVID. And I just think that maybe instead of an iron law of economics, there's sort of like this, like almost like evolutionary dynamic. And I think that benzodope might be the evolutionary adaptation to the conditions around here, which were a real, long kind of crackdown on fentanyl over a lot of jurisdictions, and then the arrival of COVID.
Economics is not a exact science. It is a social science, even though it's often treated as a kind of almost a mathematical science, right? It is subject to all kinds of exceptions and, social behavioral processes that are not explainable simply by, sort of incentives. And we're not purely economic beings, we're social beings. And so I think it fails in some ways, but it does offer some useful frames and insights. If I can wax poetic for a second, I think that, the arrival of benzodope also coincided with a lot of misery, a lot of pain, and that it's helping people cope. And so the fact that it has emerged on the illicit market is not a surprise.
If heroin's like a warm blanket, benzodope is like a weighted blanket, like a thunder blanket that you just throw over your head, right? It just seems we We are in an increasingly desperate society that's meaner and meaner. And so sometimes you just need to put out the lights. Sometimes, and I've definitely felt this, and I've used benzos and opioids for this reason, is like when you just feel like, fuck, I just wish I didn't exist right now. That's like the time for benzo dope, you know?
Listen, I think more and more people are feeling that way now. We're coping creatures, and I think people are going to continue to search out ways of coping that are not always, the most functional, but it's just a survival mechanism.
We're coping creatures, just trying to survive. That's what Leo says, and I agree. But not just criminalized drug users in BC. All of us. We all need something to take the edge off the apocalypse. This move towards decriminalization by government is a small first step. But if it comes with a crackdown on dealers, the mass dying will only get worse. We know that from 114 years of prohibition and from the Iron Law.
Television highlights of the news of yesteryear.
Crackdown is produced on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. I'd like to acknowledge the loss of two amazing community leaders this month. Kat Norris was a comrade and a fighter from Laxon First Nation. I got to know Kat when community groups banded together to fight the extra policing and gentrification that came with Vancouver's 2010 Olympics. Kat's been sticking up for people in East Vancouver since the late 1970s, and she was famous for her fry bread giveaways. I'd also like to say goodbye to Chrissy Brett. Chrissy was from the New Hulk Nation. She organized and acted as a spokesperson and defender for many tent encampments in Victoria and Vancouver, including Oppenheimer Park and Strathcona Park. Our editorial board is Simona Marsh, Shelda Castor, Jeff Loudon, Dean Wilson, Laura Shaver, Raya Jean, and, rest in peace, Dave Murray, Greg Frez, and Charisse Kiwatin. This episode was conceptualized, written, and produced by Sam Fenn, Alex Kim, Alex DeBoer, Lisa Hale, Ryan McNeil, and me, Garth Mullins. Sound design by Alex Kim. Original score was written and performed by James Ash. Special thanks also to Professor Magdalena Harris for her time and research on the UK heroin shortage. If you like what we do, please consider donating at patreon.com/crackdownpod. Crackdown is funded in part by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Stay safe and keep six.
And March 22nd, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt makes the 3.2